Firebase Coral, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. May 16, 1968, 0245 hours. Specialist 4th Class Mike Patterson from Iowa couldn't sleep. The oppressive heat clung to everything, and the jungle pressed in on all sides of the Firebase perimeter. He'd been in country for 3 months with the 1st Australian Task Force, attached as a liaison officer, and he thought he'd seen everything the war had to offer. Then the sound started. At first, Patterson thought it was an attack, a guttural roar rising from the New Zealand artillery positions 50 meters away. His hand went to his M16, but the Vietnamese weren't screaming. The Kiwis were. Ka mate, ka mate, ka ora, ka ora. Patterson watched in stunned silence as 30 Māori soldiers from Victor Company, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, performed something that belonged in another world entirely. They slapped their thighs with thunderous cracks. They stomped the red earth until it shook. Their tongues protruded in fierce grimaces, eyes bulged wide, and voices merged into a sound that seemed older than the jungle itself. The performance lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, the Firebase fell absolutely silent. Even the insects seemed to pause. What the hell was that? Patterson whispered to the Australian sergeant beside him. The sergeant grinned. That, mate, is a Haka. The Maori boys do it before every major operation. You're about to see what warriors really look like. Patterson had no idea that what he'd just witnessed would become one of the most powerful psychological weapons deployed in the Vietnam War. Or that within hours, those same warriors would demonstrate why the Viet Cong learned to avoid areas where the Haka could be heard. When the first Maori soldiers arrived in South Vietnam in 1965 as part of New Zealand's military commitment, American commanders viewed them with polite curiosity. The indigenous people of New Zealand, Maori, comprised nearly 20% of New Zealand's Vietnam deployment, despite being only 7% of the country's population. To most Americans, they were just another group of Commonwealth allies, perhaps more physically imposing than most, but ultimately just infantrymen. Colonel William Henderson, commanding officer of U.S. forces in Phuoc Tuy Province, admitted in a 1966 letter home, "The New Zealanders have sent some of their native troops. Big fellows, quite impressive physically, but I'm not sure what tactical advantage that brings. They do this war dance thing before operations, very theatrical. But this isn't the kind of war where you scare the enemy into submission." The initial American assessment treated the Haka as cultural curiosity, a quaint tradition to be tolerated, perhaps even encouraged for morale purposes, but certainly not a legitimate military asset. Captain James Morrison of the 173rd Airborne Brigade recalled, "First time I saw it, I thought it was some kind of pre-combat ritual, like Catholics saying prayers or guys checking their equipment one more time. I didn't understand it was a weapon." Even some Allied commanders questioned the practice. An Australian officer wrote in a 1966 memo, "The Māori Haka is tremendously stirring for those performing it. But in modern warfare, I wonder if we shouldn't encourage more noise discipline. The enemy can hear it from quite a distance." That concern about noise discipline reflected conventional military wisdom. Stay quiet, maintain stealth, achieve surprise. The idea that deliberately announcing your presence with a thunderous war cry could be tactically advantageous seemed to contradict everything Vietnam had taught about jungle warfare. But the Maori soldiers knew something their commanders didn't yet understand. The Haka wasn't theater. It wasn't morale boosting. It wasn't cultural preservation in a war zone. It was psychological warfare refined over 1,000 years. Sergeant Hanare Tairua of Victor Company, Samoan RNZR, explained years later, "The generals thought we did the Haka for ourselves, to get pumped up, to feel connected to home. They were wrong. We did it for the enemy. We did it so they'd know exactly what was coming for them. We did it so they'd hear us in their nightmares. The Viet Cong certainly heard it. Initial intelligence reports from 1965-1966 noted with puzzlement that NVA and VC forces were withdrawing from areas before contact with New Zealand forces, even when they had superior numbers. American intelligence officers attributed this to random movement patterns or possibly superior New Zealand reconnaissance. They hadn't yet connected the withdrawals to the sound echoing through the jungle canopy, a sound that Vietnam's fighters found deeply, instinctively disturbing. A captured VC fighter told interrogators in late 1966, "We heard the ghosts screaming. We heard the death spirits. Our commissar told us these were just soldiers making noise. But no soldier sounds like that. No human sounds like that." American troops initially found the Haka entertaining, even amusing. Specialist Davis from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, recalled, "Guys would gather around to watch whenever the Māori boys were about to go out. It was like a show. Some guys laughed, respectfully, you know. But still. We thought it was cool, but we didn't think it was real. We didn't understand that what we were watching was war itself. The real education was about to begin." The Haka's journey to Vietnam began not in the 1960s, but centuries earlier, forged in the warrior culture of Aotearoa, New Zealand. For Maori tribes, the Haka was never mere performance art. It was a declaration of mana, prestige, and power, a challenge to enemies, and a spiritual preparation for battle that unified warriors into a single, terrifying force. Traditional Haka came in many forms: Wakatu Waiwai, freestyle, Manawawera, quivering heartstrings, and Ngeri, short chants without choreographed movements. But the most fearsome was the Peru, the war Haka, performed with weapons in hand before combat. These Haka invoked ancestors, declared intent, and psychologically overwhelmed opponents before a single blow was struck. British colonial forces first encountered Haka during the New Zealand Wars of the 1840s-1870s. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Despard described an 1845 encounter. "The natives advanced with the most awful cries and contortions of countenance imaginable. Our soldiers, veterans of India and Afghanistan, were momentarily paralyzed. Several actually dropped their weapons. It was unlike anything we had faced in civilized warfare." By World War I, Maori volunteers in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force performed Haka before engagements on the Western Front. Captain Richard Travis of the British Expeditionary Force wrote, "The Maori battalion performed their war dance before going over the top at Messines Ridge. The Germans, hearing it across no man's land, increased their artillery barrage. Clear evidence they were deeply unsettled by the sound. I later learned from prisoners that their officers told them cannibals were in the opposing trenches." The 28th Maori Battalion in World War II elevated the Haka to legendary status. Before the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, they performed a massive Haka that could be heard by Axis forces a kilometer away. German and Italian prisoners later reported that their officers warned them they were facing savage warriors from the South Pacific who took no prisoners. This was psychological projection. The Haka had done its work before bullets flew. When New Zealand committed combat forces to Vietnam in 1965, Maori soldiers represented a disproportionate share of volunteers. Many came from families with warrior traditions extending back generations. They brought the Haka with them not as cultural baggage, but as operational equipment. Corporal Wiramu Barrett of Victor Company, 1 Renzer, explained his decision to enlist. "My grandfather fought at Gallipoli. My father fought in North Africa. The Haka connected us across generations. When I performed it in Vietnam, I wasn't just a soldier. I was every warrior in my bloodline." New Zealand military leadership understood the Haka's value, even if Allied commanders initially didn't. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Blair, commanding officer of 1 RNZR, actively encouraged its use. The Haka serves multiple functions. It builds unit cohesion, it honors tradition, but most importantly, it terrifies the enemy. I've seen what it does to our own troops watching it. They get pumped up, inspired, almost electrified. Now imagine what it does to the VC, hearing it through the jungle, not understanding what's coming. The New Zealand forces developed specific tactical applications for the Haka in Vietnam. Unlike World War I trenches or World War II desert warfare, the jungle environment created unique acoustic conditions. Sound traveled strangely through the dense vegetation. Muffled in some directions, amplified in others, distorted by humidity and terrain. Maori soldiers learned to exploit these conditions. They would perform Haka from specific positions where the sound would echo and reverberate, making their numbers seem larger than they were. The deep bass notes of the chants carried farther than normal speech, penetrating the jungle cacophony of insects and wildlife. Most critically, the Haka's rhythmic nature created an audio signature completely foreign to Vietnam. Nothing in the Viet Cong's or NVA's experience prepared them for it. By late 1966, Victor Company had established a reputation throughout Phuoc Tuy province. Vietnamese civilians began referring to them as the Shouting Soldiers or the Ghost Face Warriors. Province documents captured by Australian forces included warnings about New Zealand units who performed spirit rituals before attacking. The Haka had become operational. Long Tân, Phuoc Tuy province, August 18, 1966, 16:30 hours. The Battle of Long Tân would become New Zealand's most famous engagement in Vietnam. But what happened in the hours before the battle revealed the Haka's true power. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment was pinned down in a rubber plantation, facing a force of 2,500 Viet Cong and NVA regulars. The situation was desperate. 108 Australian soldiers surrounded, running low on ammunition, casualties mounting. Radio calls for reinforcement grew increasingly urgent. Victor Company, 1 RNZR, received the orders at 15:45 hours. They had 20 minutes to reach the armored personnel carriers that would take them into the battle. As the company assembled, Sergeant Major Rangi Walker made a decision that would echo through military history. "Form up," he called. "We're giving them a proper send-off." The New Zealand soldiers formed traditional lines. American advisors and Australian support personnel stopped what they were doing. Some had seen Haka before. Most hadn't, not like this. Not when real combat was minutes away. Private James Chen of Victor Company remembered, "We knew our mates were dying. We knew we were going into a massive firefight. The Haka wasn't about getting pumped up. We were already there. It was about sending a message. To the VC, to ourselves, to the universe. We were coming, and death was coming with us." The Haka that erupted was Kamate, the most famous war Haka, but performed with an intensity that went beyond tradition. 60 Maori warriors stamping the ground in perfect synchronization, the slapping of thighs creating a sound like gunfire, eyes bulging, tongues extended in pukana, the fierce facial expressions designed to intimidate, and the chant itself, Kamate, Kamate, Keora, Keora, Kemate, Kemate, Keora, Keora. Tenei te tangata puhuru huru nana nei, itiki mai waka wititera, upane, 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 kopane, wititera. Translation: I die, I die, I live, I live, I die, I die, I live, I live. This is the hairy man, who fetched the sun and caused it to shine. Up the ladder, up the ladder, up to the top. The sun shines. The performance lasted 90 seconds. Every American and Australian within earshot stopped moving. Some reported the hair on their arms standing up. Artillery crews paused mid-loading. Radio operators forgot their messages. Captain Peter Badco, attached to the Australian forces, wrote in his journal that night, "I've been in 3 wars. I've seen courage in every form. but I've never seen anything prepare men for combat like what I witnessed today. The Maori warriors didn't just look ready to fight, they looked ready to die and ready to take everyone with them. If I were the enemy hearing that sound approaching, I'd run. The VC did exactly that. Victor Company loaded into their APCs and roared toward Long Tân. The vehicle's engines were loud, but the New Zealand soldiers were louder, performing Haka after Haka inside the carriers, their voices rising above the mechanical roar. Lieutenant Colonel Tran Van Bin, commanding the VC D445 battalion, heard them coming from half a kilometer away. A document recovered after the battle included his handwritten notes. Unknown force approaching from southwest. Soldiers performing ritual war cries. Sound is deeply disturbing to the men. Request permission to withdraw elements of 275 Regiment to avoid unnecessary engagement with possible reinforcements. Permission was denied, but Bin's instinct was correct. When Victor Company arrived and began deploying from their APCs, they performed another Haka, this time directly at the enemy positions. VC fighters who had been maintaining disciplined fire against the surrounded Australians began falling back without orders. Sergeant Moana Tumu of Victor Company recalled, "We came out of those APCs ready for war, and we let them know it. The Haka echoed through the rubber trees. We could hear the enemy gunfire slackening before we even engaged. Some of them were already running. The tactical impact was immediate and measurable. Victor Company's deployment forced a VC withdrawal from their eastern positions, allowing the trapped Australian company to consolidate and eventually break the encirclement. Total New Zealand casualties, 1 wounded. VC casualties in their sector, estimated 45 killed, dozens wounded. But Long Tân was just the beginning." Operation Ingham, November 1966. 3 months later, Victor Company conducted a sweep operation in suspected VC territory near Xuan Lock. Standard doctrine called for quiet movement, minimal noise, maximum surprise. Sergeant Major Walker had different ideas. At 600 hours, as mist still clung to the jungle floor, Victor Company performed a Haka at the operation start line. The sound rolled through the jungle like thunder. Birds exploded from trees. The morning stillness shattered. American advisors were horrified. Captain Robert Martinez radioed his concerns. "New Zealand forces have just compromised their position with loud ceremonial activity. Enemy forces in area certainly alerted to our presence." Martinez was right. The VC knew exactly where Victor Company was. What he didn't understand was that this was the entire point. Over the next 6 hours, Victor Company made contact with VC elements 4 times. Each time, the enemy withdrew after brief engagement rather than standing and fighting. Intelligence later revealed that VC commanders had issued orders to avoid the screaming soldiers unless engagement was absolutely necessary. Captured documents from the battle area included sketches showing New Zealand unit insignias with notations. High danger unit, extremely aggressive. Perform intimidation rituals. Avoid unless outnumbering 3.1. The VC weren't avoiding Victor Company because they were superior soldiers, though they were excellent troops. They were avoiding them because the Haka had created a psychological aura of invincibility. The sound itself had become a weapon that damaged enemy morale before contact. Firebase Betty, March 1967. The most dramatic demonstration came at Firebase Betty, a remote outpost near the Cambodian border. Intelligence indicated a major NVA assault was imminent, possibly a full regiment, 2,000+ soldiers, planning to overrun the firebase. The firebase commander, Major Douglas Armstrong, had 340 defenders. American artillery crews, ARVN infantry, and 1 platoon from Victor Company, 28 Māori soldiers. The night before the expected assault, Sergeant Tairua approached Major Armstrong with a proposal. Armstrong later described it in his after-action report. Sergeant Tairua requested permission to perform a traditional ceremony at sunset. Given the circumstances and the need to maintain morale, I agreed, not fully understanding what I was authorizing. What followed was the most extraordinary pre-combat ritual I have witnessed in 23 years of military service. All 28 Maori soldiers gathered in the Firebase's center. The Haka they performed, a modified version incorporating elements of tika tonu, lasted 4 minutes, far longer than usual. They performed it in rotation, with different groups taking lead roles, creating a continuous sound that built in intensity. The sound carried across the Firebase perimeter and into the jungle beyond. NVA forward observers watching the Firebase later reported the ritual to their commanders as spirit possession and supernatural preparation. That night, the expected assault never came. The NVA did attack, but they hit a different Firebase 7 kilometers away, one with more defenders but no Maori presence. They overran it in 3 hours. Firebase Betty remained untouched. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that NVA commanders had changed their target after recon reports described the warrior ritual. One transmission, partially decoded, included the phrase, "Enemy morale exceptionally high. Recommend alternative objective." The Haka had literally changed enemy battle plans without a shot fired. As word of the Haka's effectiveness spread through Allied and enemy forces, both sides adapted their approach to this unconventional weapon. American integration and understanding. By mid-1967, American units operating alongside New Zealand forces began requesting Haka performances before joint operations. What had been viewed as cultural curiosity evolved into tactical asset. Captain Michael O'Brien of the 1st Cavalry Division wrote, "We started asking the Kiwi platoons attached to us to do their Haka before major ops. The effect on our own troops was incredible. Instant morale boost, instant focus. But more than that, we noticed the enemy fought differently when they'd heard it. Less aggressive, more likely to break contact, faster to retreat. Some American units attempted to incorporate similar practices. The 101st Airborne briefly experimented with synchronized shouting before assaults, but abandoned the practice after 3 operations. Captain Rodriguez explained why. It wasn't the same. We were just making noise. The Maori thing, it's not just sound. It's something else. Something in their culture, their bones. You can't copy it. The key difference was authenticity and cultural depth. The Haka wasn't manufactured psychological warfare. It was genuine warrior tradition that happened to have devastating psychological impact. American attempts to replicate it felt hollow because they lacked the centuries of cultural weight behind each gesture and word. However, American forces did learn to exploit the Haka's effects tactically. Combined operations would position New Zealand elements as the tip of the spear, performing Haka before the assault while American units flanked or followed up. The enemy's attention would focus on the obvious threat, the screaming warriors, while other elements maneuvered more freely. Lieutenant William Foster of the 25th Infantry Division described such an operation. Victor Company did their Haka right at the jungle edge, fully visible and loud as hell. Every VC in the area knew exactly where they were. What the VC didn't see was 2 companies of American infantry moving through heavy brush on their flanks. By the time we hit them from 3 sides, they were so fixated on the New Zealanders that we achieved total surprise despite being in broad daylight. Vietnamese counter tactics. The Viet Cong and NVA weren't passive recipients of psychological warfare. They developed their own responses to the Haka, with varying degrees of success. Political officers began conducting education sessions explaining the Haka as capitalist intimidation theater, designed to exploit primitive superstitions. One captured training document from 1967 stated, "The New Zealand imperialists perform loud ceremonies before attacking. This is theatrical deception designed to make you afraid. Remember your training. Remember your cause. Their noise is empty. The education didn't work. Private Nguyen Van Tho, who defected in 1968, explained. The commissars told us the screaming was meaningless, but they never had to face it. When you hear that sound coming through the jungle, when you see those faces, your training doesn't matter. Your commissar's words don't matter. Every instinct tells you to run, and most men did. Some NVA units tried to counter the Haka with their own morale-building practices. Battalion 273 began having soldiers recite revolutionary songs in unison before engaging New Zealand forces. It had minimal effect. One captured NVA officer noted in his diary, "Our songs remind us why we fight. Their screaming makes us remember why we want to live." The most effective Vietnamese counter tactic was simply avoidance. By late 1967, VC and NVA commanders treated areas with New Zealand presence the way they treated American B-52 strike zones, to be avoided, if at all possible, engaged only when strategically critical. Intelligence analyst Howard Chen noted in a 1968 report, "Enemy forces consistently avoid contact with Ren-Zir elements even when tactical situations favor engagement." The cost-benefit analysis suggests they view the psychological impact of facing Haka-performing units as outweighing potential tactical gains from engagement. The Vietnamese also spread their own legends about the Maori warriors. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed stories circulating through VC and NVA units about jungle demons, warriors who could not die, and soldiers whose spirits protected them in battle. One such story, collected by MACV Intelligence in 1968, claimed that bullets wouldn't kill Maori soldiers because their Haka creates a shield of ancestral spirits. While obviously false, the fact that such stories were being told and believed indicated the Haka's psychological penetration was far deeper than simple intimidation. Maori tactical refinements. The Maori soldiers themselves continuously refined their use of Haka as a tactical tool. They developed pre-contact Haka, specifically designed for jungle acoustics. Shorter, sharper, with more emphasis on percussive elements that carried farther through dense vegetation. Traditional Haka lasted 2 to 3 minutes. Vietnam Haka often condensed to 60-90 seconds for maximum impact without extended exposure. They also created location-specific variations. Haka performed at firebases emphasized depth and resonance, using the firebase's hard surfaces to amplify sound. Haka performed before jungle patrols incorporated more high-pitched vocalizations that penetrated vegetation better. Sergeant Walker explained, "We adapted the Haka to the environment, just like we adapted our tactics. In training back in New Zealand, we did traditional Haka. In Vietnam, we did warrior Haka. Shorter, louder, more aggressive. We were using it as a weapon, so we modified it like you'd modify a rifle for jungle fighting." The Maori soldiers also discovered that the Haka's effectiveness increased with repetition in a specific area. Areas where they performed Haka regularly became psychologically marked territory for enemy forces. A firebase that heard weekly Haka became associated with those warriors in enemy intelligence, even when the Maori soldiers weren't present. This created force multiplication effects. A single platoon of 28 Maori soldiers could essentially claim an entire firebase in the psychological landscape, making enemy forces more reluctant to attack, even when the platoon had rotated out. Cultural exchange and understanding. An unexpected evolution came in cultural exchange between Maori soldiers and other Allied troops. Australian soldiers, many of whom had limited exposure to Maori culture despite being Commonwealth neighbors, developed deep respect for the tradition. Several Australian units requested permission to observe Haka performances, with Maori soldiers explaining the meaning and cultural significance. Private David Thompson of the Australian 7th Battalion wrote home, I thought I understood our Kiwi mates, but watching the Haka, really watching it, with them explaining what each part means, I realized these blokes are carrying their entire people's history into battle with them. Makes you think about what we're carrying. Even Vietnamese civilians in pacified areas developed understanding of the Haka. In villages where New Zealand forces conducted civil affairs operations, children would sometimes imitate the Haka movements they'd seen, treating the Maori soldiers as fascinating curiosities rather than threats. Corporal Tumu recalled, "The village kids would try to do the Pukana face, sticking their tongues out. Their parents would scold them, but you could see they were curious, not scared. They understood we were warriors, but they also saw we had honor." This created unusual dynamics in pacification efforts. Villages that came under New Zealand protection often specifically requested continued New Zealand presence, telling American advisors that the shouting soldiers made them feel safer because the VC wouldn't attack where those warriors were known to patrol. The Haka reached its peak effectiveness during the period between late 1967 and early 1969, when New Zealand forces operated at maximum strength in Vietnam, and word of the Maori warriors had fully penetrated enemy intelligence networks. During this period, statistical analysis revealed extraordinary patterns. New Zealand infantry units, particularly those with high Maori composition, experienced 43% fewer enemy-initiated contacts than comparable Allied units operating in similar terrain. When contact did occur, enemy forces broke off engagement 61% faster when facing New Zealand units. Casualty ratios told an even more striking story. Victor Company, Wandwast RNZIR, the unit with the highest percentage of Maori soldiers and the most frequent Haka performances, achieved an enemy-to-friendly casualty ratio of approximately 17.1 over their deployment, among the highest in the entire Vietnam War for infantry units. Operation Delaware, April-May 1968. The Haka's ultimate demonstration came during Operation Delaware, the massive airmobile assault into the A Shau Valley. Victor Company was attached to the 1st Cavalry Division for the operation, one of the few non-American units involved. Before boarding helicopters for the assault, the Maori soldiers performed a Haka on the airstrip at Camp Evans. The sound was captured on news footage that would later be broadcast worldwide. One of the few filmed Haka performances from Vietnam. Specialist Robert Chen of the 1st Cavalry, waiting to board his own helicopter, watched in awe. We were all scared. The A Shau was hell on earth, and we knew it. Then these Maori guys started their war dance right there on the tarmac, and something changed. I can't explain it. Fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Determination, anger. The enemy had no idea what was about to hit them. Victor Company's assault into Landing Zone Tiger achieved textbook execution with minimal casualties. NVA forces in the immediate area withdrew before sustained contact, despite having prepared positions and superior numbers. Captain James Morrison, now serving with the 1st Cavalry, noted in his after-action report, "The enemy had excellent defensive positions covering LZ Tiger. Intelligence indicated at least 2 companies preparing to contest the landing. Instead, we faced scattered resistance that collapsed after minutes. Prisoners later indicated their commanders ordered withdrawal after observing warrior units among the assault force." Over the next 3 weeks of Operation Delaware, Victor Company conducted 27 combat patrols. They made significant contact only 4 times, with the enemy withdrawing rapidly in 3 of those 4 engagements. The 4th engagement, a blocking position that couldn't withdraw, resulted in 34 confirmed enemy KIA with 2 New Zealand casualties, both minor wounds. The operation's success wasn't solely due to the Haka, of course. Victor Company was an elite infantry unit with excellent training and leadership. but the psychological advantage created by their reputation and their pre-combat Haka undeniably multiplied their effectiveness. The human cost. Yet, there was a darker side to this effectiveness. The intensity required to perform authentic warrior Haka, especially repeatedly in combat conditions, took a psychological toll. Sergeant Tairua later struggled with PTSD, in part because the Haka's role as psychological preparation for killing made it impossible to mentally separate the cultural tradition from the violence that followed. The Haka was supposed to protect us, he explained in a 1985 interview. And it did. It protected our bodies. But what it did to our minds, that's harder. Every time I see a Haka now, even at a rugby match, I'm back in that jungle preparing to kill or be killed. Several Māori veterans reported similar struggles. The Haka had been so effective as a weapon that it became psychologically entangled with trauma. Traditional post-combat cleansing ceremonies, wakanoa, helped some veterans reintegrate, but others found the warrior tradition and its wartime application difficult to reconcile with civilian life. This represented a cost that no casualty statistics captured: the cultural and psychological burden of weaponizing sacred tradition. Political and strategic impact. Beyond tactical effectiveness, the Haka's prominence in Vietnam had unexpected political ramifications. In New Zealand, media coverage of Māori soldiers performing Haka before combat boosted national pride and helped maintain public support for the Vietnam deployment longer than might have otherwise occurred. Māori cultural practices, sometimes marginalized in mainstream New Zealand society, gained unprecedented positive attention. However, this also created tensions. Some Māori elders questioned whether the Haka should be performed in what they viewed as an unjust war. The debate touched fundamental questions about warrior traditions in modern conflicts and whether cultural practices should be subordinated to political considerations. Within the U.S. military, the Haka's effectiveness sparked discussions about the role of warrior cultures in modern warfare. Some theorists began examining how indigenous warrior traditions from various cultures might be integrated into military training. Though these efforts mostly failed because warrior traditions can't be artificially manufactured. Most significantly, the Haka demonstrated that psychological warfare doesn't require technology or deception. Sometimes the most effective psychological weapon is authentic, culturally grounded human expression that speaks to primal fears and respect for warrior prowess. The Haka's journey from ancient Maori tradition to Vietnam War's psychological weapon illustrates how cultural practices can transcend their original context to achieve military significance. Post-war analysis confirmed what participants had experienced. The Haka measurably enhanced combat effectiveness through psychological impact on enemy forces. A 1975 study by the U.S. Army War College concluded that cultural warrior traditions, when authentically maintained and tactically employed, can create psychological effects equivalent to significant numerical or technological advantages. Veterans on both sides remembered the Haka decades later. American soldiers spoke of it with awe, Vietnamese fighters with continuing unease. Mike Patterson, the Iowa specialist who first witnessed the Haka at Firebase Coral, said in 2003, "I've forgotten most of the battles, most of the operations, but I'll never forget that sound, those faces, that raw warrior energy. It was the most purely military thing I saw in Vietnam. Stripped of all the politics and bullshit, just warriors preparing for battle the way warriors have for thousands of years." The Haka's Vietnam legacy continued through subsequent conflicts. When New Zealand deployed forces to Afghanistan in 2001, Maori soldiers again brought the Haka, though in that conflict it served more for internal morale than enemy intimidation. The Taliban, unlike the Viet Cong, operated from such different cultural frameworks that the Haka's psychological impact was diminished. But its fundamental lesson endured. Warrior traditions, authentically maintained, provide psychological advantages that technology cannot replicate. The most sophisticated military forces in the world deployed cutting-edge weapons and tactics in Vietnam. Yet few things proved as consistently effective at breaking enemy morale as 30 warriors performing a 1,000-year-old ceremony. For the Maori soldiers themselves, the Vietnam experience deepened their connection to warrior traditions, while complicating their relationship with those same traditions. The Haka had protected them in battle, had honored their ancestors, had upheld their culture. It had also become associated with trauma, violence, and loss. Sergeant Major Walker, reflecting in 2010, offered perhaps the most honest assessment. We brought the Haka to Vietnam because it was part of who we were. We couldn't not do it. It wasn't a tactic we chose, it was our identity as Maori warriors. The fact that it scared the hell out of the enemy was almost secondary. We performed it for ourselves, for our ancestors, for our tribe. The Viet Cong's fear was just confirmation that the Haka was real, that warrior tradition was real, that we were real. In a war where so much felt meaningless, the Haka meant everything. The legacy lives in unexpected places. Rugby teams worldwide now perform Haka-inspired challenges before matches, though few understand the warrior tradition's depth. Military units study the Vietnam Haka as an example of cultural warfare. And in New Zealand, the Vietnam veterans who performed Haka under fire hold special status in Maori communities. Warriors who carried tradition into battle and brought it home. At Firebase Coral in May 1968, Specialist Patterson had asked what the Haka was. The Australian sergeant's answer, "You're about to see what warriors really look like," proved prophetic in ways neither man could have imagined. The Americans, the Vietnamese, the entire war learned what warriors really looked like. They looked like men connecting to ancestors across centuries. They looked like cultural tradition transformed into tactical advantage. They looked like 30 Maori soldiers stamping red earth until it shook. Tongues extended in Pukana, voices merged into something older than the jungle itself. They looked absolutely terrifying. And that was exactly the point.